If you are anything like me, you probably don't have a clear understanding of what is happening in Israel and Palestine right now. You, like me, have questions. If you are one of the naive souls thinking a terrorist group called Hamas arbitrarily attacked Israel on October 7th for twisted religious reasons, I assure you, it brings me no pleasure to inform you that you have been duped. You have been bamboozled by a very effective propaganda machine that serves a very specific narrative. It shouldn't come as a surprise to you, though. The last few years have done nothing if not expose some of the most dangerous and egregious lies ever presented to the public. Why would the propaganda be any different when it comes to Israel? Okay, this is a good time to leave if truth exceeds your intestinal fortitude, but I'd encourage you to stick around. To start with, we were told that Hamas is an extreme radical terrorist organization, but that doesn't seem to be true. We were told that Hamas decapitated 40 babies without so much as a stitch of evidence, and now ANP and other media outlets, along with the White House, have quietly retracted those exaggerated claims. Believe me, I was just as surprised as anyone to find out Hamas is a political party that has its roots in humanitarian efforts and came to power through what appears to be an honest election process. They didn't do it alone, though. Believe it or not, Israel funneled millions of dollars to help Hamas rise to prominence, and in 2005 removed them from the terrorist watch list and labeled them a political party. This was done because Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, was thought to be getting too large, so Israel wanted to weaken it by supporting an opposition. Even though Hamas had a military, it was far from formidable, and the very fact that it was rooted in humanitarianism encouraged Israel to financially support Hamas, which, looking back, may have been a serious miscalculation. There isn't a single Arab nation, however, that refers to Hamas as a terrorist organization. President Erdogan of Turkey, an ally of the United States, publicly referred to them as freedom fighters. Ironically, Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Ethan Allen, and other American colonial freedom fighters were all labeled terrorists by England. We were also told that Hamas is a proxy radical terrorist group for Iran. That is also not true. Iran has a very capable military for sure, ranking 17 out of 45, and simply does not need Hamas any more than Hamas needs them. Iran, east of Israel, has stated it condemns atrocities Israel has exacted on Palestinians over the years and will not stand by for the wholesale slaughter of innocent civilians any longer, which is a sentiment expressed throughout all the Arab nations. From the Iranian point of view, however, a war with Israel is the last thing they want, not because they fear defeat, because they clearly don't. It's because they, just like the United States, have bigger fish to fry. They have just sealed a deal with Saudi Arabia, bringing a stability between the two nations that has never existed. In January, Iran becomes a full member of the newly formed BRICS, and like other BRICS members, are looking for stability and prosperity, not war. Lebanon in the north has echoed exactly the same sentiments as their neighbors. Hezbollah should not be underestimated, however. If push comes to shove, they could invade from the north and boast the only military that has defeated Israel's air defenses. Since October 7th, fighting between Israel and Hezbollah has begun again, and Hezbollah has been very effective in taking out Israeli M60 tanks. So far, I believe they have destroyed 18 tanks in their crews. Of course, Hezbollah has sustained losses as well, but the point being, Israel isn't the Middle Eastern superpower everyone thought they were. Before I get too deep, please allow me to clarify one personal thing. I'm an American. More specifically, I'm a constitutional American, as was my father, his father, and many generations before. It's how I identify. And as an American, I don't care about your religion. I only care about your right to practice it, and I will fight for your right to do so. Religious practice in this country outside the church, synagogue, or mosque is a very private thing, and we feel strongly that it should stay in the none of your damn business category. We hardly ever talk about our spiritual preferences unless someone asks, and after that, we can't seem to shut up about it. Well, you may have noticed about every couple of years, America gets hit with an ad campaign accusing us of being anti-Semitic. We hear of anti-Semitism being on the rise despite seeing absolutely zero evidence of it. Most of us just ignore it because, to be honest, most of us don't even know what the hell that means, let alone give it any credence. Maybe Jewish people think anti-Israel is anti-Jewish because it turns out there have been quite a few anti-Israel demonstrations over the years, and nobody paid attention, but maybe we should have. You can rest assured that everyone is paying attention now. I've always thought of Israel as just another democratic country like us, with their only significant difference as being Judaism is their dominant religion while Christianity is ours. Which would be true, except for the inconvenient truth that there's nothing democratic about Israel. And while Christianity may be the dominant religion in our country, it is far from being the only one. We give tax-exempt status to all religions. The Church of Satan even has tax-exempt status. That's how inclusive we are. That is not true of Israel. It is specifically stated in their own version of the Constitution that Israel is specifically for Jews. And while Palestinians inside of Israeli borders were finally granted citizenship after 20 years of occupation, they are not granted the same rights as Jewish Israeli citizens, especially when it comes to freedom of movement. Their so-called citizenship defines, or rather brands them with Palestinian citizen resident, which does not even extend to their spouses. Outside the physical walls of Israel, the people of Gaza, the Palestinian Arabs live with very few of the liberties that Israeli citizens take for granted. What makes the most recent Israel-Palestine conflict different is not just the size and scale of the attack on Israel, but the massive and unexpected support for Palestinians all over the world, in spite of the head start mainstream media had to sell the dubious state narrative. The other big difference, and definitely worth paying attention to, the aircraft carrier Eisenhower and Ford were sitting battle-ready in the Red Sea, and they didn't come alone. They brought 4 state-of-the-art battleships, 4 cruiser-class missile launch platforms as escorts, and who knows how many nuclear subs. That's World War III kind of power. You can believe they are not here for Hamas. The expectation is extreme escalation, and I want to know why. You do too, don't you? I was once sent to South Korea with the task of observing the Republic of Korea on Rock Army because they were considered the most battle-ready. They needed to be due to their close proximity to North Korea. I was pretty impressed, and we learned quite a bit from the Koreans and were able to implement their clever tactics, especially with our artillery battalions. Because Israel has similar logistics as Korea, my expectation was that they too would be in a state of battle readiness. After all, their entire defense strategy is structured specifically so that they would not get caught by surprise. October 7th exposed just how weak Israel is and how wrong I was. From a military standpoint, Hamas handed Israel a professional military defeat carried out with precision and with less collateral damage than any of Israel's recent attacks on Gaza. They were able to breach what was thought to be an unbreachable perimeter and overpower military outposts. I know the press made a big deal of the amount of rockets that were fired into Israel, but Iron Dome did a fine job of defending against them in spite of the volume set. Now here's something you might have missed. And it's another example of how you know this as a professionally well-planned, well-executed operation. Hamas clearly knew exactly how many Iron Dome missile heads Israel had and how to make Israel expel them. We sent them at the last 321 we had, but there's no chance they could fend off another full-scale missile attack. Israel knows this, United States and NATO knows this, and most importantly, Hamas knows this, which means every Arab nation also knows of this vulnerability. Netanyahu's answer was to call up 300,000 reserve troops that barely received any training during their 32 months of mandatory service and are in no condition even to pass a physical, let alone engage in urban warfare that they have never been trained in an area protected by seasoned soldiers that know the area like the back of their hands. Since most of the area has been blown to rubble, there's no longer a grid predictability to it. Sending troops into Gaza would just be suicide. World powers won't let Israel carpet bomb like they want to for obvious reasons, and by their own admission, they wouldn't be hitting us anyway. They're in fortified tunnels well below any significant impact effects, so Israel would, and world powers know they would only be killing civilians. We have to be honest here. Everyone wants peace in the Middle East and sees Israel as standing in the way of that. Saudi Arabia has stated there will be no stability with Israel until there is a Palestinian state. An all-out war would obliterate Israel altogether, along with everything else in the region, escalating the conflict globally with no way to turn back. So Israel has no choice but to go along to get along at this point. Israel has had internal problems as well. Netanyahu is facing serious charges of bribery and corruption. Of course, innocent until proven guilty, but it looks like he is guilty and will most likely face prison time, and quite possibly his wife as well. He also tried to change what amounts to Israel's constitution, giving the executive branch authority over the judiciary in what looks like an attempt to remain in power and avoid prosecution. Under his new constitution, if not Netanyahu didn't like a judge, for any reason, he could just keep firing judges until he got the verdict he wanted. If you remember right, that did not sit well with Israeli citizens, and mass protests followed, leading the world to believe that Israel was bursting at the seams with all the ingredients of a civil war. October 7th ended the protests for now, but this will not go away for Netanyahu. It's clear, at least in an objective military sense, it's game over for Israel. So how did Israel end up in this mess anyway? Well, the question relies on the knowledge of Gaza as a whole. The best way to describe Gaza is the world's largest open-air prison. Some may take issue at that descriptor, but it's high time the world knew the truth. It became an open-air prison almost immediately after the formation of the nation-state of Israel. It currently has a population of about 2.3 million people living in 5 governorates: North Gaza, Gaza City, Deir el-Balah, Khan Yunis, and Rafah. Those are divided into 165 smaller disconnected sections or cantons, cut off from each other by military checkpoints, walls, fences, settlements, and other structures. Bordered by Israel and Egypt on the Mediterranean coast, the strip is only about 141 square miles. At only 25 miles long, it can take less than an hour to drive from Rafah in the south and to Hanun in the north. When I say it's the world's largest open-air prison, I'm not exaggerating. There are only 2 ways in or out. The Ezra crossing on the Israel side and the Rafah crossing on the Egyptian side, and both are heavily militarized by the Israeli Defense Forces with 30-foot walls, prison-like guard towers, and concertina wire in layers. So why is the United States so concerned about what appears to be an exclusively Arab problem to the average American? Well, following the money seemed to work in every other conspiracy, and it didn't let me down here either, but it also added yet even more questions. The only real money I care about is what this is costing the American people, and it's a lot more than I expected. Hold on to your horses because the price tag to date is a staggering $300 billion and growing. The Pentagon will publicly post it as only $260 billion, but for some reason decided the Iron Dome missile defense system and the cruise missiles we have over there are not part of the calculation. So I took the liberty of correcting that minor accounting error. You're welcome. Now, to fully understand what it is we are paying for, we have to roll the clock all the way back to 1913. I know, it sounds boring, but I promise to do my very best to give you the shortest version possible and to be as accurate as possible. But most of all, you can expect the truth as seen from this average American's eyes. In the early 1900s, empiring was a big thing, and nobody was empiring more than England. World War I was at a standstill, and deaths, the trenches on both sides were totaling 10 million and would amount to about 16.2 million by the end of the war, for next to no gain at all. But England wasn't done empiring, so they set their sights on Africa and the Middle East with the goal of destroying the Ottoman Empire and splitting up the Turks-conquered territory in Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia, which is Iraq. They knew they couldn't do it alone, so they made backroom deals with France, Italy, along with a promise of a state of their own to Arab leaders, Faisal and Abdullah, and tried to cut a deal with Russia, whom declined. About this time, Zionism was catching on due to Theodor Herzl's earlier publication of Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish state. Herzl believed the only way for Jews to be free from persecution is to have a nation of their own. Sounds like a good idea, right? Prime Minister George of England needed the U.S. to stay engaged in the war effort and saw the rising Jewish presence and influence in U.S. government as an opportunity to leverage the 2 millennia-old desire to fulfill a Zionist state to do it. The Balfour Declaration was the kickstarter for that. It was a public pledge by Britain in 1970 declaring its aim to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine because in the eyes of the British, if they conquered the area, they could do what they wanted. This did not sit well with the Arabs, though, because they too had an agreement with Great Britain for the same thing and were becoming increasingly aware that Zionism was simply modern colonialism born out of British colonial rule. The only difference was that it didn't have a metropole yet, but was on a mission to create one as a permanent safe haven for the world's Jews. As a twist, by sheer delusion or Machiavellian ideology or both, Zionism actually marketed itself as an anti-colonial movement, even against the British Empire, the very womb it came from. The population had gone from 9% Jewish in 1922 to 27% by 1935, with an estimated 60,000 fleeing from Nazi-occupied Europe. In 1936, Palestinian Arabs launched a large-scale uprising against the British and their support for Zionist settler colonialism, known as the Arab Revolt. The British authorities violently crushed the revolt, but it took them until 1939 to do it, and in the process destroyed at least 2,000 Palestinian homes, put 9,000 Palestinians in concentration camps, and subjected them to violent interrogations, including torture, and deported 200 Palestinian national leaders. At least 10% of the Palestinian male population had been killed, wounded, exiled, or imprisoned by the end of the revolt. This would set the tone and the stage for the treatment of indigenous Palestinians for the foreseeable future. Britain at one point tried to curtail the immigration of the European Jews, but the Zionist lobby in London overturned the efforts, then turned around and declared war on England, bombing the British headquarters in the King David Hotel. That killed 91 people. How's that for gratitude? In early 1947, the British government announced it would be handing over the disaster it had created in Palestine to the United Nations, thus ending its colonialization project in the Middle East. On November 29, 1947, the UN adopted Resolution 181, recommending the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, fulfilling its promise to the Jews to have a state of their own. What also became evident was that establishing a Jewish state in Palestine was meant to rid Europe of its Jewish problem, referred to as the Jewish surplus, at the expense of another inferior colonized collective, the Palestinians. The final conclusion was that in order for a Jewish state to materialize, the local population were displaced and replaced. It also became clear that England never intended to fulfill its promise of supporting a separate and sovereign Arab state. Even though the Jews in Palestine constituted 1/3 of the population, they only owned less than 6% of the total land area. Under the UN partition plan, that all changed and were allocated 55% of the land, encompassing many of the main cities with Palestinian Arab majorities and the important coastline from Haifa to Jaffa. The Arab state would also be deprived of all the key agricultural lands, freshwater, and seaports, which led the Palestinians to reject the proposal. Predictably, following the UN Resolution 181, war broke out between the Palestinian Arabs and the armed Zionists. The Zionists had gained extensive combat training and arms buildup from fighting alongside Britain in World War II. The Palestinians were left woefully underarmed and lacked the organizational skills the Zionists and didn't stand a chance. Though displacement of Palestinians from their lands by the Zionist project was already taking place during the British Mandate, the real mass displacement started when the UN partition plan was passed and Ben-Gurion declared Israel a nation. Jews took over. By the first half of 1949, at least 750,000 Palestinians in total were forcibly expelled or fled outside their generational homeland of 2,000 years in what is known as the Nakba, which is Arabic for catastrophe. Those that refused to move were murdered on the spot, right in their family homes. Zionist forces had committed uncountable atrocities by then, including the massacre of thousands of innocent civilians, bombings of homes, lootings, and the destruction of entire villages to ensure the people they kicked out would never return. In the years that followed the establishment of Israel, the state extended its systematic ethnic cleansing. The irony here is the Jews were now doing to the Palestinians what the Nazis had done to them. I'm struggling with that. Though armistice agreements had been signed with Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon in 1949, it was a waste of paper because the newly founded Israeli army continued to commit a number of additional massacres and campaigns of forced displacement of Palestinian Arabs. For example, in 1950, the remaining 2,500 Palestinian residents of the city of Majdal were forced into Gaza Strip. About 2,000 inhabitants of Bir el-Sabit were expelled into West Bank, and some 2,000 residents of the two northern villages were driven into Syria. While Zionist project fulfilled history of creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine in 1948, it did so at an absolutely unforgivable price. During the 1967 Arab-Israeli war known as the Nakba, meaning setback, Israel took the remaining Palestinian territories of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, and continues to occupy them today. Under the UN partition plan, which some may argue England had no right to do in the first place, Israel was allocated 55% of the land, but today it controls more than 85% of historic Palestine. The Nakba led to the displacement of some 430,000 Palestinians, half of which originated from the areas occupied just 2 years earlier, and now were twice refugees. As in the Nakba, Israeli forces used military tactics that violated basic international rights law, such as lethal attacks on unarmed civilians and forced expulsions. Most refugees fled into neighboring Jordan, while others going to Egypt and Syria. I feel compelled to mention it was also during this time the unarmed surveillance ship USS Liberty was deliberately and mercilessly fired upon with missiles and 50 caliber machine guns by Israeli forces, killing 2/3 of the crew. The recorded audio chatter proves they knew they were unarmed, and they knew they were American. The cover-up was astonishing, as the incident didn't see the light of day for decades. They even had the repairs done in record time in Malta so it could sail back into San Diego as if nothing ever happened. The remaining crew were under orders to never speak of the tragedy, and no explanation or apology was ever given for the attack. After the Nakba in 1948, the United Nations and the International Court of Law were so appalled at the sheer brutality of the Zionist displacement of Palestinian Arabs that they denounced their action as inhumane and ordered the stolen lands returned. Of course, the lands were never returned, and as of 2018, Palestinians began unarmed peaceful protests at the border called the Great March of Return, at which 709 people were killed by sniper fire, and unknown gas bombs were detonated into the crowd, rendering many people unconscious. Now, I hope to God that number is inflated, but I have seen time-stamped video of snipers taking out reporters and other innocent unarmed protesters. I refuse to post those videos, but if you want to see them, you can check out the videos Abby Martin has. She has been following this story going on 2 decades, I believe. Today, across 2 governments, each in power for roughly half of 2021, Israeli authorities doubled down on policies to repress Palestinians, to advance privilege for Jewish Israelis. The government's policy of maintaining Jewish Israeli domination over Palestinians across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, coupled with particularly severe repression against Palestinians living in the OPG, amounts to the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. In May 2022, more discriminatory efforts to force Palestinians out of their homes in occupied East Jerusalem, resulting in 11 days of hostilities between Israel and Palestinians. The Israeli military said it struck 1,500 targets in Gaza with ground and air-launched munitions, which, according to UN figures, killed at least 120 Palestinian civilians. In September 2023, we witnessed another 400,000 displaced Palestinians after Israeli Defense Forces claimed it moved into Nor Sham's refugee camp near the town of Tukaram to destroy what it described as militant command center and bombing storage facility in a building. At this time, there have been no confirmation of the existence of a command center or a bomb storage facility in the area. The only bombs were the ones IDF detonated. This was the very event Hamas claims prompted what they call a counterattack October 7th, that Israel claims was a first strike. No matter what really happened, or rather what story you choose to believe, I think we can all agree at this point that the killing is beyond justification and simply has to stop. I could go on about the conditions of Palestinian Arabs have been forced to live in by Zionist Israel. And I could go on about the murderous rampage Israel has been on for the last 75 years, just because there's plenty to draw from. But by now, you're at least starting to get that the narrative surrounding the Palestinians is riddled with half-truths at best. But if you were to believe legacy media, one would assume Israel is the shining beacon of democracy and fairness in the Middle Eastern sea of Islamic oppression. But a much darker truth emerges if anyone bothers to look. One of the main discussions within our studies is whether Israel has a claim right to the area. After all, one could argue after 2,600 years, it could be questionable. But thanks to 21st century science, specifically DNA analysis, we can be sure there's a definite ancient genetic connection to the area, specifically Judea. The Jewish claim is that their history goes back some 4,000 years, but in the interest of science, we'll stick to the genetics because after the 3,000-year mark, the DNA gets a little fuzzy, as it was described in one modern science magazine. The genetic markers even show different exiles Jews suffered over the centuries by how the blood was mixed with European countries they fled to, which would explain why so many Jews barely resemble their ancient ancestors. Not all Jews left Judea, though. Thousands remain behind, and while there is an unbroken lineage of Jews that lived there continuously for 3,000 years, genetics show us that many Jews converted to Islam, and others in their new adopted countries even converted to Christianity. All people have both male and female genetic markers, and with the modern Israeli Jew, we found the female genetic markers were anywhere from 60 to 90% European, and the male markers were around 50 to 60% Jewish. When matched with the Palestinian genetic markers, the so-called Jewish genetic markers were indistinguishable from the European Jews. The major difference here is European Jews reflects the many exiles and the intermarriages that one would expect from displacement, showing them to be as much, if not more, European as they are Jewish, whereas the indigenous population shows no dilution of Arabic or Jewish genetics. Whether any of the genetic information entitles Jews to colonize Palestine is almost an irrelevance at this point. I think it's an interesting point that the first European Jewish settlers didn't colonize by conquest. Large Arab landowners sold the land to them. After the British forced exile, they occupied more than they owned for sure, but those Jewish folks managed to purchase around 6% of the land area, fair and square, before declaring itself a nation. So I don't think anyone can dispute the rightful ownership of that land. Personally, I believe genetics do not tell the entire story. The religious practice of the European Jews has indeed remained consistent and unbroken for 3,000 years, as evidenced by the indigenous Jews that never left ancient Judea, that still practice the same way as the displaced European Jews, and that, more than genetics, seem to be the real defining bond of the ancient and modern Jewish population. So be it controversial or not, from a genetic viewpoint, I believe Jews did what they had to do to survive over thousands of years with at least some of their genetics intact, and have returned to their ancestral homeland many times only to be forcibly expelled again and again. If this were the only time in recorded history they tried to return to ancient Judea, I'd say it would be a tough sell, to say the least, but that is not the case. So yes, I believe they did have a right to return to their ancient homeland, diluted blood and all. What they don't have the right to do is massacre, imprison, torture, and eradicate their ancient, legitimate genetic brothers and sisters. And it is ethically, morally, and just plain wrong for Americans to be endorsing it, let alone using the fruits of American labor to do it. I've heard Americans say, turn Gaza to glass. I think you all know what that means. And if your heart is so dark that you can morally justify the murder of 2.5 million of God's children, then it is without a single reservation that I say that you need to recalibrate your moral compass. Remember this, every single country in the world sees a two-state coexistence in Palestine and Israel. There are only two countries standing in the way of that, Israel and the United States. I think 15,000 dead Palestinians and 1,400 dead Israeli is enough, don't you? If it isn't, feel free to add blowing up an entire block-sized apartment complex, killing another 150 innocent people, just on a rumor that a Hamas leader might live there with no confirmation before or after the bombing that Hamas leader was ever there. I want to leave you with this. I find it hard to believe that in 75 years of inhumane apartheid occupation and the very worst of human atrocities that nobody in our government knew, Israel has always been treated with kid gloves, and they have never been held to account for the most extreme war crimes in history outside of Nazi Germany. Maybe it's because 89% of our sitting Congress and Senate have dual citizenships with Israel. Am I the only one that finds that a little curious? Look, I believe there's room for everyone in this world without violent conquest. And who wouldn't? Palestinians very much have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness without being subject to crushing apartheid rule and displacement every bit as much as the Jewish Israeli people do. Aloha.